this is where it helps to have a lot of chemistry background. So what we have here is OpenStack's version. Now, I think OpenStack classifies them into two major classes. I further subdivide, it's kind of weird. It says two major classes, and then kind of salami slices them into like two or three more classes. But these are the ones I want you to know. So monoamines or amino acid derivatives. So mono, what number does that refer to? Monorail, monocol, that only refers to one, right? So this refers to all of these hormones that are made from a single amino acid. If you don't know what amino acids are, I forgot if it was in chapter 2 or chapter 3 in OpenStax, but you might want to read up on that. So amino acid derivatives, and what happens if you daisy chain a bunch of amino acids together to make a protein or polypeptide? You have these peptides. So when you have all these little beads right here, these are amino acids, and they're all linked together with bonds. And these are also amino acids, but now we're not showing the individual ones. We're just showing the 3D structure of this. But they both involve amino acids. They both involve chains. But what's the difference between a peptide and protein? Well, proteins are made from peptides, and the short versus long, okay, that's kind of like, there are some very short peptide hormones, but let's just call them collectively peptides for this class. I don't think, maybe when you get to, like, if you're going to graduate or professional or med school, you might have to know about smaller peptide, like hormones or neuropeptides, but not at this level. And steroids. So steroids are more than just the steroids you think of when people get busted for that at the Olympics or in bodybuilding. Steroids is it's not just one singular type of chemical, it's actually a whole class of chemicals. And not all steroids are the same, and we will talk about them pretty soon in future lectures. And things like testosterone, again, one of the primary male sex hormones, and progesterone, one of the primary female sex hormones, and also very important in the menstrual cycle. So these are our three major classes, and I'm just going to lump these two for our class. Now, I'm going to show you the Martini version if you have the Martini book, and this is where I want you to be careful. So there are three major classes it lists. So it has this monoamines, and then you have your peptides, and you have your steroids and lipid derivatives. That's what it calls it. But if you have the Martini version, again, this is not to throw shade at the person who wrote this chapter of Martini, but I'm pretty sure whoever wrote this chapter of Martini is not an endocrine physiologist. Again, as you can tell, I'm really passionate about endocrinology, but this is where I'm like, okay, they don't know what they're talking about. So lipid derivatives, when it talks about eicosanoids, these are paracrine factors. They are made from lipids. That's what derivative means from. It's made from lipids, it means from fat, but they are not hormones. They act in paracrine fashions. And then amino acid derivatives, technically they're true. Thyroid hormones are made from amino acids, but there's a little twist. We have a whole lecture on thyroid hormones, why I explain the more fine parts of this, but thyroid hormone is almost doesn't quite neatly fit into these three major classes. It's made from amino acids, but it does something else. I'll explain more as we get through this chapter. But let's talk about the simplest. So amine hormones, these are the simplest ones, because why? And this is why I often refer to them as monoamines. So here we have tyrosine. Now, for those of you who never had chemistry, you're like, oh crap, what the heck is this? So, or if you had basic chemistry, you might not know what this is. You might say, okay, I recognize hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen. There's two hydrogens here, but what's the rest of this geometric mess and scary looking thing? Well, what we have here is, so let's talk about a simpler compound. Here we have carbon dioxide. And I think they call it a Lewis structure, but you might have seen carbon dioxide. Well, this is the chemical formula. But what's another way of drawing it is drawing the central carbon and then drawing the bonds, covalent bonds that link carbon to oxygen. If you don't know what covalent bond is, chapter 2. So bond is something that links two atoms together. Okay, that's at the very basic part. And there's electrons involved. Again, if you want more detail, go to chapter 2. And I know I'm going to lose somebody because someone's like, oh my god, too much chemistry, I'm out. But what we have here are two oxygen molecules, and we have double bonds linking the carbon to each oxygen molecule. Now here we have formaldehyde, and what's another way of drawing formaldehyde in a similar manner? So these are both carbon dioxide. So another way to draw formaldehyde is like this. So we have our carbon, we have two hydrogen atoms, we have oxygen linked to the carbon via double bond. Now, if you haven't had organic chemistry yet, this is something organic chemistry, and you see it in medicine and pharmacology a lot. Often to make something simpler, because you're involved with organic chemistry, a lot we're carbon-based. When we talk about carbon-based organisms, we're all made from we have carbon all over our bodies and all these compounds and chemicals in our bodies. So sometimes they just omit the carbon. They just draw the lines, and if there's no explicit atom being mentioned, you assume it's carbon. So in tyrosine over here, if we drew all the carbons, it would look something like this. But for organic chemistry, what you often see, just assume that to make things simpler and easier to see, you just remove all the carbon atoms. They're there, they're just not being explicitly pointed out. So you remove the carbons and their associated hydrogens, and this is a carbon backbone of this tyrosine molecule. So that's what you meet all these angles and all these lines mean. Phew, okay, so amino hormones, catecholamines, these are made from tyrosine. So tyrosine, as you can see here, is a chemical. And then tryptamine, and more specifically, it's an amino acid. Tryptamines are made from another amino acid called tryptophan, and that has a different chemical structure. Now, thyroid hormones, these are made from two tyrosine amino acids. I'll probably cover that at the end of this lecture. Again, but this is why when I refer to amine hormones, the ones that are made from a single tyrosine or a single tryptophan, in general, they behave similarly. So again, Martini considers thyroid hormones as amino acid derivatives. Technically correct, but it's slightly misleading. You shouldn't just think, okay, thyroid hormones are made from tyrosine, therefore they act like tyrosine hormones made from tyrosine. Not quite true. Now, monoamines, these are made from single amino acids. So when we refer to amine hormones, I'm pretty much referring to the ones that I will say monoamine. I will be referring specifically to the ones that are made from single amino acid. So there's a limited handful of these amine hormones. So here we have our two starter amino acids. It's either tyrosine or tryptophan. And maybe there's a more exotic one we haven't discovered yet, but these are the ones we know. So from tyrosine, basically what's happening is a bunch of chemistry. So between each step, something slightly changes. Here we have added another few atoms right here, a hydroxyl group. But what we notice here is that you're using all these enzymes. And hey, remember from last semester, most enzymes, not all, they end with ASE. You have all these enzymes. They're kind of shuffling around the atoms and slightly altering the chemical structure of tyrosine. But with all these different enzymes, you're making things like dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Again, if you came here from PHYL 141, that might sound very familiar, right? And then tryptophan, here we have, this is like very organic chemistry with the numbering, but we have something called serotonin from tryptophan. So we have a neurotransmitter being made from tryptophan. Now let's talk about catecholamines. So catecholamines, they all are derived from tyrosine. So again, all these chemicals, all these enzymes that are converting and slightly tweaking these chemicals between each chemical reaction here. Now things like dopamine, norepinephrine, or epinephrine, also known as adrenaline, like especially countries that are Commonwealth countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, they like to use adrenaline versus epinephrine. And instead of calling norepinephrine, they often say noradrenaline. So again, norepinephrine is not the same as epinephrine, but epinephrine and adrenaline, they are the same, just different names. Okay, so what I'm getting at here, why I'm showing all of these chemicals? Well, what do you notice in common between all of these? They all kind of preserve this hexagon, this ring of 6 carbon atoms. So this is what we have here. We have a common structure that's preserved from tyrosine. And this right here, when you have these two oxygen and hydrogens with what we call a hydroxyl group linked to this ring of carbons, this is what we call catechol. So catechol, as you can see, is contained within all three of these chemicals. That's why we call them collectively catecholamines. Now tryptamines a little easier. So catechol is like, okay, you go from tyrosine to catechol. Well, tryptamine sounds like tryptophan, right? So if you have tryptamine, it's made from tryptophan. And what do we notice here? Well, serotonin and melatonin. So what happens is that you have tryptophan and it's being converted and shuffled around slightly in using biochemistry, enzymes, and sort of metabolism. But what we have here, instead of having just this hexagon right here, we have a hexagon linked to a pentagon. Again, I'm trying to make it very simple so that you don't need organic chemistry to understand what we're talking about here. But what we have here is they have a preserved structure that's among all these derivatives from tryptophan. Now, somebody might be like, wait, aren't epinephrine, norepinephrine, and serotonin and dopamine neurotransmitters? And yes, you are correct. They are neurotransmitters, but aren't we talking about hormones? So the thing is that these are chemically the same, but in neurotransmitters and in the nervous system, we're having that synapse. Remember, you have all those dendrites and the axon terminals. You have the axon terminals and dendrites. The axon terminals release all those neurotransmitters, and they bind to receptors on the dendrites. Well, that's in the nervous system. Those are neurotransmitters. But when you have a synapse, these chemicals are a neurotransmitter. They have specific targets. So whenever you have a neuron releasing a chemical onto a target cell, it's very specific. It's meant to hit that target cell. Whereas in the bloodstream, if you now have a chemical and now it's going to the bloodstream and can be potentially distributed again everywhere in your body, that becomes a hormone. So now instead of having a specific cell you're targeting with a synapse, now you have this this very same chemical structure. If you just look at the chemical itself, it's the same formula, same atoms, same chemical structure. But now instead of going onto one specific cell, it's going potentially everywhere in the body by this bloodstream. Now, the thing is that this is why, again, why I make a big deal. Monoamines, thyroid hormone is not a monoamine.